Hello and welcome to LSO St Luke's. My name is Rachel Leach and today I'm joined by 4 musicians from the London Symphony Orchestra. John Alley on piano, Angela Barnes on French horn, Chris Deacon on trumpet and Dudley Bright on trombone. And together we're going to take you on a whistle-stop tour through 5 periods of music history. We're going to show you what to listen out for, who the main composers were, what the dominant shapes were within music, and give you lots of pointers towards your further musical understanding section of the oral paper. So we're going to start right back in the year 1400 with the Renaissance period. Now everything, as you'd imagine, was different back then. The instruments didn't look anything like they do today. So instead of violins and cellos, we had viols. Instead of clarinets and oboes, we had things like reed pipes. But one instrument that you will recognize is the recorder, which has remained unchanged since all the way back then. The brass family was completely different as well, but one instrument that was very similar was the trombone. Back then it was called the sackbut. It made a different noise and it was slightly different shaped, and we'll see one of those a little bit later on. The dominant forms of music were largely vocal because it was easier to sing than use an instrument that might not really work the right way. And if you want to remember the dominant vocal forms of the Renaissance period, you need to remember the 3 M's: masses, motets, and madrigals. The Mass is a large-scale piece. It's a setting of the Christian liturgy. So if you're listening out for words like Gloria, Agnus Dei, Requiem, and singing in Latin, chances are it's a Mass. A motet is also a religious song for smaller forces and sung in parts. And a song about an everyday subject such as love or nature is a madrigal. Again, it's usually sung in parts. Instrumental music was largely divided up into dance suites. So different dances were put together back to back for entertainment. So you need to remember words like pavan, allemande, galliard, courante. There's dozens of different dance styles. So if you just know a few of them, you can start to pinpoint which one you might be listening to on your exam. A pavan is easy to remember because it's a processional dance. It's in 2, and it sounds as if someone is walking into the room. A galliard has a distinctive rhythm in 6 that goes like this. An allemande is slightly more serious and slightly more spiky, but the most popular dance of the Renaissance period was the courante. Courante means running, so there's often a lot of movement in a courante. It can be slow or it can be fast, but there's usually a lot of quavers. It's usually got 3 beats in a bar. And the dominant composers back then were people like Palestrina. He was a writer of religious vocal music. In England, we had Thomas Tallis and William Byrd. They wrote vocal music, both religious and secular. John Dowland did a bit of everything, another English composer, and then the great Monteverdi. Monteverdi's dates span the end of the Renaissance and the beginning of the Baroque period. He was the first opera composer, but he also wrote a lot of religious oratorios. So if it sounds big, and it sounds operatic, and it sounds Renaissance, it's probably Monteverdi. And in the Renaissance period, you need to listen out for unusual instruments, as we've already said. Modes providing the harmony rather than major or minor scales. Intervals of a 5th or a 4th, which is a very open sound, rather different to what you hear later on when the interval of a 3rd and a 6th is dominant. A slower harmonic rate. Chords take a little while to change, and often pieces might just have 2 or 3 chords in them. You might get a piece with just 1 harmony all the way through and a drone running along the bottom, just 1 long bass note. But the most interesting thing about Renaissance music was its use of rhythm. Composers back then weren't afraid to change meter, so often you'd get a piece of music that would flick between 2 beats in a bar, 3 beats in a bar, and 4 beats in a bar. So if things sound a little bit uneven and unpredictable rhythmically, the chances are it's from the Renaissance period. Renaissance meant renewal, which means experimentation. It was a time of great development and excitement, rather similar to the 20th century, but rather more tuneful. We're going to listen now to a piece of music played on the sackbut so we can get an idea of the difference between the trombone and the sackbut. Dudley's going to play for us a piece by John Dowland. This started out as a pavan, so it's got that processional feel in 2 beats in a bar. But Dowland changed it into a song called Flow My Tears, a very sad, lamenting song. Originally, it would have been sung by a high male voice, which nowadays we'd call a countertenor, and it would have been accompanied by a lute or a guitar. Today, we're going to hear it on a sackbut, which is an original instrument from that period, but accompanied by piano. So you're going to have to use your imagination a bit. And listen in particular to the last chord. Something rather interesting happens at the very end.
「 Thank you.
Thank you, Dudley. That last chord was suddenly in the major key. So we'd been going along in a very open A minor modal sound, but the last chord had a sharpened third degree, a C sharp. And the term for that is tierce de Picardy. That's a really useful little term. It comes up a lot every year on the exam, so get that in your head. A piece of music that's in a minor key and at the very end becomes major. That's a tierce de Picardy. And while Dudley's just sat right next to me, I'm just going to quickly ask him for the difference between a sackbut and a trombone.
Well, the best thing is to look at them, really. And, well, the first thing is one's shiny and one's not. But that's quite interesting, because in the days of the sackbut, they would have probably started out shiny when they were made, but they didn't have any way of keeping them shiny, so that's why they always look like that. But probably the next thing is that it doesn't have a valve, which most trombones have these days, which gives you an extra fourth of range at the bottom. Another thing is that the bore of the sackbut is very small as compared with the modern trombone.
You mean how wide the tube is?
How wide the tube is,
yeah.
Yes, if you can just look there. It probably doesn't look a lot, but in terms of playing, it is quite a lot. And the bell on a modern trombone is much larger as well.
Does that mean it's louder?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
It depends how you play it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dudley. The Baroque period ran from 1600 to 1750. Now, a quick word about the dates. It's not as if on New Year's Day everybody said, oh, I fancy some Baroque music today. There was a lot of gradual change between the periods. Innovations took time, different countries moved at different rates, so there's a lot of overlap in reality between the different styles. But for the purposes of your A-level, you need to really fix down on these dates. So the Baroque period started in 1600 and ran to 1750. Now, if you look at the lovely picture of the orchestra on the screen, you can see that it's starting to look a bit similar to what we've got today. We've now got violins, violas, cellos, and basses, but the strings are made from animal gut, so there's a thinner sound to the texture. The bows are also lighter, and there's less vibrato being played. In the woodwind section, we now have flutes, but they're made of wood, and oboes and bassoons with less keys on them, so they can do less than they do today, and sometimes the tuning isn't necessarily as spot on as it is with a modern instrument. There are still no clarinets. In the brass section, we now have trumpets and French horns, but they don't have the complicated valve system that they do today, so what they can do is a lot more limited. And they're relying on the player's lips, the insertion of extra tubes, and in the case of the French horn, the hand going in the bell to create the full scale. The most important thing about the Baroque period is the harpsichord. Now, a harpsichord is an early form of piano. Piano uses a system where the strings are hit by a hammer, whereas a harpsichord, the strings are plucked, which gives a very twangy, distinctive sound. If you hear a harpsichord in a piece of music during your A-level exam, the chances are it's from the Baroque period. Almost every ensemble in Baroque period had a harpsichord in it, and the job of the harpsichord was to fill in the chords. They were providing what's called the continuo. The important composers in the Baroque period were people like Handel, Vivaldi, Bach, Telemann, and Monteverdi, who was still writing his operas. And in England, we had Purcell, who wrote a lot of sublimely beautiful English songs. Usually they were for a dramatic reason, for theatre. So if you hear a beautiful, beautiful song in English from the Baroque period, the chances are it's by Purcell. Now, back then, composers were servants. They had jobs within great big ducal families, and they had to churn out music on a daily basis. They were writing music for religious services, for ceremonies, for entertainment. So they all wrote a huge amount of music in all different genres. The dominant forms of music back in the Baroque period were the concerto. Concerto is a piece with one soloist accompanied by an orchestra. The concerto grosso, which is similar, but instead of one soloist, you have a group of soloists accompanied by a bigger group. Bach's Brandenburg concertos, which are on the syllabus, are concerto grosso. The dance suite was still popular as well, but now it was played mostly on a keyboard instrument, a harpsichord, virginal, spinet. Those pieces still have the forms we talked about earlier, pavan, galliard, allemande, and are usually in binary form. So you have an A section that repeats and a B section that repeats. And vocal music still was very, very dominant. Masses were getting more massive. So the clue is in the word there. A mass becomes a very big thing with a lot of singers and a huge orchestra, again, singing in Latin, the Christian liturgy. Opera is becoming more and more important. Opera is a sung story. And cantatas, which are smaller songs, often religious. Bach wrote a lot of cantatas. We're going to hear John now play a bit of one of Bach's keyboard suites and see if you can guess which dance it is. Thank you, John. Originally, that would, of course, have been played on a harpsichord. That was a courant, and you can tell that because of the constant movement of quavers. So in the Baroque period, listen out for major and minor tonality. So we're now firmly within a key. Modes have gone, and we're either in a major tonality or a minor tonality. Chord progressions leading towards a cadence, an expected cadence. But the chords aren't that unusual. Primary harmony. Bass lines are really important. Sometimes you might have the same bass line repeating over and over again with different things happening on top. When that happens, the posh word for it is a passacaglia. The less posh word for it is a ground bass. Both of them are absolutely correct. Heavily ornamented melody, lots of twiddles, twists, and turns. During Baroque period, everything was overly decorated. People's clothes had lots of embroidery. They had big curly wigs. Buildings had gargoyles stuck on the side, and furniture was intricately carved. Everything was overly decorated, and so was the music. And the biggest indicator that we're in the Baroque time is the harpsichord, playing the continuo, twanging away in the middle. We're now going to hear a movement from a trumpet concerto from that time by Telemann. This is from 1708. Now, back then, it would have been played on a natural trumpet. Natural trumpets work by just using the notes of the harmonic series. So if you need a melody, it has to be pitched really high, where the notes of the harmonic series are next door to one another and can create a melody. Chris is going to play on a piccolo trumpet using valves, which was invented long after this. Listen carefully to it and tell me afterwards the texture that you're listening to. particular that the melody was just an elaboration of the harmony underneath, and there wasn't much symmetry between what John was playing, John was representing the orchestra, and Chris on the trumpet, but the ideas were going back and forth. Harmonically, we were sticking really to primary chords. It did modulate, but it did so in a very obvious way. And there was a lot of extra ornamentation in both the piano line and what the trumpet was doing. Those embellishments really are a bit of a giveaway that we're in the Baroque period. And what texture was it? Well, it was homophonic. So let's just take a minute to talk about these textures because they always come up on the exam. Homophonic music is where you have a melody and chords, or where you just have block chords. So if I was to sing Happy Birthday and John was to accompany me with some chords, don't worry, it's not going to happen, that would be homophonic. If I was to sing Happy Birthday on my own, that would be monophonic, just one idea. But if I was to sing Happy Birthday with Dudley, singing the same notes, that would also be monophonic, one idea, people playing or singing in unison. And then there's polyphony, polyphonic music. If all of us were to play Happy Birthday, but with a counter melody and a bass line and some extra twiddle somewhere and all the lines interweaving around one another, that would be polyphonic music. It's really useful to learn those three textures. And that piece was homophonic because there was a melody and an accompanying chords underneath.